Welcome again, Newsroom. And this is gonna be a summary of the past 3 months, more or less, what we normally do. So we'll see what's been happening in the summer, which is not yet officially over anyway. So we'll be covering everything that happened at the intersection of data, marketing, privacy, and technology, which is what we always do. We're going to be sticking to the same 5 usual blocks, except that we will add AI, of course, to the competition and digital markets block. That's where we chose to put it. So, we start with e-privacy and legal updates. And within e-privacy, we start with enforcement. And we're going to be kicking it off with Spotify. The audio streaming service received a €5 million fine for an insufficient privacy notice. So, as you know, this is directly connected with the transparency principle in in Article 5 of the GDPR, and a core principle of data protection and data privacy. So, let's hear the headlines.
According to the Swedish Supervisory Authority, Spotify's privacy policy does not inform clearly enough about how this data is used by the company. The IMY added that Spotify should be more transparent about how and for what purposes individuals' personal data is handled.
Indeed. In any case, this enforcement originated in NOYB's complaint concerning Spotify's failure to respect access rights, so to respond to a data subject access request in a proper way. But the agency disagreed with a particular complaint on this particular issue, and then simply pointed towards what it thought was wrong, which is again the privacy notice. So moving on, but staying in Sweden, this comes from the Swedish DPA's, or from the agency's own press release on July the 3rd, 7 days prior to the EU Commission's approval of the EU-US data privacy framework.
4 companies must stop using Google Analytics.
So, a juicy headline, we've heard it before, but in fact what happened is Tele2 and 3 others were pretty unlucky in terms of timing, as said. So the telco operator was fined €1 million, along with the other smaller companies, for using Google Analytics, which in the end means, or it meant back then, which is not so long ago, sending data to the US without enough additional safeguards to complement the standard contractual clauses, the SECs, that the platform relied on after the Privacy Shield had been invalidated by the Schrems II judgment. So again, we've debated that forever, but it was an impossible mission. And as said, the EU Commission found adequacy for such transfers under the new EU-US Data Privacy Framework, or DPF, 7 days later. More.
Meta and Criteo got a taste of the headaches to come across multiple jurisdictions concerning their behavioral targeting practices.
So on July the 4th, Norway asked the Facebook owner, Meta, to stop processing data in the country while relying on contractual necessity or legitimate interest for ad targeting. So, and at the same time, or in parallel, the CNIL, the French DPA, imposed a €40 million fine on Criteo for A, failing to verify that valid consent had been obtained for the roughly 370 million EU-based individuals whose data had been processed. B, using an incomplete, again, privacy policy in which certain processing purposes were missing and others were expressed in, as it said, vaguely and broad terms. C, failing to add key provisions concerning the exercise of user rights in its joint controllership agreements. A common scenario in that space in ad tech. And D, failing to respect the individual rights of access, erasure, and consent withdrawal. So, with regards to this, identifiers that are kept in your browser remain in place even after blocking personalized ads once you requested, again, to be excluded from the Criteo platform or from the personalization. In parallel, Meta made a few important decisions in connection with the enforcement actions that have kept us pretty entertained for many months now. So on July 17th, WhatsApp adopted legitimate interest as a legal basis. Again, so Article 6, GDPR, so for its processing of personal data, while Facebook and Instagram will revert to consent, and that will make a lot of people happy. I guess they kneel, for starters. So they move away from the contractual necessity basis they had adopted, right, in the months that preceded the arrival of GDPR, that resulted in that fine from the DPC in Ireland and so on. And aside from this, Meta also chose not to make Threads, so the X or Twitter killer app, available in the EU, dodging what some called a privacy nightmare, because he had chosen also legitimate interest for it, and there's a whole story that we'll link to. Moving on to legal updates and guidelines. Let's hear it.
In case GDPR-related enforcement actions were not enough, additional headwinds are expected across the entire programmatic advertising ecosystem worldwide in the face of 1. A string of state-specific privacy laws in the United States, 2. The FTC's agenda, 3. Digital Services Act, and 4. The EU Digital Markets Act.
So, in going into the details, first, applicable privacy laws beyond California, right? In Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, and Virginia impose an opt-out of targeted advertising, which can be complied with by following a similar process to what we have been seeing and doing in California. They do not sell or share my personal information, as it's called, that choice. Now, this includes the compulsory processing of the global privacy control signal from browsers that support it. And we have also explained this in the past, in other episodes. The threshold for most companies, right, so those that do not make a living out of selling personal data, they're not data brokers or something similar, is 100,000 unique visitors, and that's my term. So it says processing, they normally say processing data about 100,000 individuals in the state. But how do you measure that? So the metric that tells you this is about people and not just visits on a website would be unique visitors, which is a metric that few will be able to obtain in the absence of cookies and IP-based geolocation to know that they also come from that state. So that sort of makes it even more confusing. You need to do something that will require an opt-out in order to know whether you need to comply. Anyway, the FTC, second issue discussed in the headline, is closely scrutinizing the use of sensitive categories of data in cross-site tracking and social media advertising. So we've discussed that, the BetterHelp and these other cases in the spring newsroom, in our latest update. So go listen to that or read it if you want to. A third piece of this puzzle is the EU Digital Services Act, which is in force since August 25th, and this has introduced a ban on targeted advertising for children or based on special categories of personal data. And it also imposes increased levels of transparency in terms of applicable parameters in the relevance of a particular ad, and it obliges very large online platforms, as it calls them, and very large search engines to allow consumers to opt out of personalized ads and recommendations. So we'll see a string of measures being taken by different platforms to comply with this. That's the DSA. And the last piece here is the DMA, the EU Digital Markets Act, which will not really have teeth until March next year, but it will force consent as a legal basis on gatekeepers that want to use personal data for targeted advertising. And an initial list of companies qualifying as gatekeepers was released last week. And there were no surprises, right? We've got Alphabet, so Google, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance or TikTok, Meta, and Microsoft. Now, I've already mentioned this in passing, but here's the big news now in full, a headline.
The EU Commission gave the green light on the EU-US data privacy framework on July 10th.
So, in other words, it found adequacy in the instrument, in the DPF. Shortly after clarified, this will not do away with the need for a transfer impact assessment for standard contract clauses or binding corporate rules, which can benefit from the new safeguards provided by the US government. But again, you still need a TIA. But temporary peace of mind is assured for EU businesses dealing with US providers which have registered under the DPF. Of course, there'll be a new sequel, to the Schrems saga within some 2 years. But it seems like he may be beaten to it. There's a new French activist in the scene trying to sort of destroy the DPF before Max Schrems does. We'll add a link to that. Okay, more.
The Council and EU Parliament reached an agreement on the new Data Act.
So, as we mentioned in passing during our recent interview with Leonardo Cervera, who's the Secretary General of the European Data Protection Supervisor, this will enhance the free flow of data generated by IoT devices and other digital products, and it will expand portability rights beyond, what the two scenarios, the two legal bases that today grant portability rights, right? So, contractual necessity and consent. More.
A new CJEU ruling confirmed that the right of access could, in certain cases, include the need to know the identity of specific employees of the data controller, as well as the time and instances in which such employees had been accessing a data subject's individual record.
So not much to add here, except that the decision relates to a DSAR, so Data Subject Access Request, made in Finland by a former employee of the bank that acted as a data controller, and that he was probably very angry at some of his former colleagues. But you can go and read it. We've added a link to it. More.
Cybersecurity-related laws keep piling up. As per new SAC rules, material cybersecurity incidents will have to be disclosed by public companies within 4 business days of a material determination. Also, an extended deadline expired at the end of June for financial services companies to comply with the FTC safeguards rule when it comes to holding customer records.
I will add to that something similar is happening in the EU with the so-called DORA coming up. Compliance is required by January 25, and DORA imports the NIST risk management framework for the management of cybersecurity incidents in the financial services sector to the EU. And in Spain, let's hear it.
Spain's supervisory authority updated its cookie consent guidelines, at long last aligning them with the EDPB's published criteria. A reject all button should now be offered on the first layer.
So indeed, at long last, no more hiding this under configuration, right? It's accept or reject. Something we've been writing about, talking about for some 5 years, but now it's happened. Although the door is now open as well to cookie walls, sadly, akin to those that we see publishers in France or Germany use now, so consent or pay. There. So much for not putting a price on a fundamental right. And companies have a January 24 deadline to adapt to this in Spain. Moving on to MarTech and AdTech.
On September 7, the Privacy Sandbox reached general availability after slowly finding its way into most instances of the Chrome browser. This was preceded by various updates on the manner in which the cookieless solution beats hushed email addresses or third-party cookies in terms of performance.
Exactly, and the Topics API block can already be found in Chrome's privacy settings if you look there, if you have it, if you use it. More.
TCF 2.2 keeps making progress on the back of Google's own auditing of consent signals for conformity with the so-called Additional Consent Mode Technical Specification prior to the September 30 deadline.
Nothing to add to that, except that you can read more about it in our previous newsroom, in the spring newsroom update. There's more details, specific details.
Amazon has expanded its product ads to third-party sites like Pinterest, BuzzFeed, Mashable, or Lifehacker.
This one will drag the e-commerce giant directly into the biggest possible mess in terms of cross-site tracking, but I'm sure they have a plan for it. What else?
The IAB released a first version of its data cleanroom guidelines for DCR interoperability.
Indeed, and we are still referring to matching encrypted audiences, so a still gray area when it comes to privacy compliance or the need for specific consent on both ends, right? And I refer here to my interview with InfoSam's Nicola Nuit on this podcast a few months ago. Moving on to another chapter, which we now title AI, very conveniently, competition and digital markets. So in early July, the CJEU agreed with the Federal Court of, for matters of unfair competition in Germany, so the Bundeskartellamt, if I'm pronouncing that well, and it agreed that privacy issues can be part of competition-related rulings, which is pretty big. And specifically, the court had prohibited Meta from combining user data from several sources without specific consent from said users. So now there's green light for this. We'll see where that leads. At the end of the same month, so again July, France's competition regulator filed an action against Apple for applying different tracking standards to its own services after the App Tracking Transparency, ATT, that policy change that we have debated here for many weeks, made it harder for third parties to rely on unique device identifiers, right? The IDFA in the mobile world. Moving to AI.
The hangover from OpenAI's grand entrance in the public discourse continued to rip through existing regulatory initiatives. The last-minute addition of Article 28B to the EU AI Act, through the EU Parliament's amendment, introduced a long list of obligations. This has ended up pitching open-source generative AI frameworks against the commercial giants and showed important cracks in the proposal.
Certainly, a Stanford University team attempted to expose the manner in which tools on both sides of the aisle would perform across various types of requirements. And it's an interesting document, how they're scoring all of these tools. More.
An avalanche of AI governance and responsible AI frameworks is making it harder to pick the most appropriate one for a company's intended use of foundation models.
We have added a link to such matrix in the show notes and associated blog post. Well, copyright took center stage in the same generative AI debate, and many in the industry have been considering that data scraping of public content is fair use. Right, it's an exception that exists in copyright, or fair dealing in the case of the UK. In fact, some laws like the Japanese copyright law, which is more recent, even contemplate the possibility that you would train, data mining, text mining, that those users would be allowed exceptions to copyright. But it remains to be tested. And there's people that have been sort of covering their backs, so Google changed their terms of service to make it clear that they would rely on publicly available data for AI training purposes. But others, like Adobe, have made it clear that their own tool, so Firefly, very conveniently, was only trained on stock images it owns. Of course, Adobe owns a lot, so it benefits them to think this way. But as opposed to Midjourney or, DALL-E or other image generation tools, Adobe is already claiming that this is the only way to be properly covered in terms of compliance. And it got to the point that it got so far as to promise legal cover and for its customers. To sort of support this vision, some authors have been suing OpenAI for the use of their work in order to train ChatGPT. So the company has been helping website owners to opt out of future training datasets. And as it's been saying, you could add the GPT bot, which is their bot, or any other bot, into the robots.txt file for your website, which is the file we've been using forever, to tell search engines not to index our content if we don't want it to be found through a search. So it's the same thing. You add the GPT bot to the list and it's excluded. But of course, that trend is most likely to entrench those that have already done it. Now, Microsoft, for its part, doubled down on Adobe's promise and also offered legal protection to customers of its Office 360 or GitHub Copilot products who choose to create content or code with its own OpenAI-powered tools. But beyond copyrighted works, the very real possibility of dragging publicly available personal information, so beyond copyright, right, privacy, often in the context of semi-public social media, for example, into training datasets, this provoked a joint statement by multiple data protection agencies demanding compliance with the data protection framework, which is already in place, as we've seen many times. AI does not exclude what we already have. We already have 6 legal bases, and we already have a framework if you are using personal data to train your AI. So, an even more concerning possibility is that one is employing non-public personal data for said training purposes. And this also sort of exploded in the summer with a separate public outcry. Zoom, so the video conferencing platform, became an initial target after introducing the possibility in its updated terms of service. But then it reverted to requiring prior user consent. Moving on, the biggest antitrust case in some 20 years will kick off this week when the US Department of Justice faces Google. In fact, today. A summary judgment ruling was made available a few weeks ago, narrowing the scope of the battle that will follow. Moving on to pets, so privacy-enhancing technologies and zero-party data.
The UK's ICO issued new guidelines encouraging businesses to embrace privacy-enhancing technologies.
So the use of pets is something that the US government has also been pushing for since at least 2021, and in fact both countries have joined forces to award specific prizes to companies innovating in the space. Beyond that, Google and Meta released their own AI assistants, and the concept of the AI, personal AI, we've been debating this one for a while as well, but now they're taking shape in different forms. So Google's is called Duet, and Meta's are called AI personas. And in parallel, LinkedIn founder Reid Hoffman helped launch or co-launched, or I don't know how involved he is, Inflection AI, which is a company that has released its own sort of AI-powered personal assistant. So whether any of them can really fulfill the promise of individual agency or zero-party data remains to be seen. Now, to finish, I'm moving to the future of media. Google first.
Google reached agreements with over 1,500 publications across 15 countries under the EU Copyright Directive.
Indeed, and in a move that runs in the exact opposite direction,
Meta decided to stop sending traffic to Canadian publishers after a recent legal change.
So this change was similar to Australia's recent initiative, which we discussed, to force a payment for the content being indexed. But the social media platform felt it was not worth the effort, as publishers get more value from that traffic than Facebook or Instagram do from said news in a world of infinite user-generated content. And this is it. Enjoy the few days officially left in the summer, and I look forward to our next interviews and seasonal updates. Good day.